Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. After a decent period of reflection on our 2023 reading, it's time to look ahead. My husband's grandfather Leonard lived to be 104 and told me once that the secret was to always have things to look forward to. With this in mind, I went to visit friend of the pod, Chrissie Ryan, owner of Book Bar in North London, a bookshop that celebrates the social side of reading. It's Chrissie's job to keep her ear to the ground, and so join me in the bookshop as we go through her highlights from the month to come, plus some tips and strategies for avoiding feeling overwhelmed by that TBR. It's probably not possible to think any more about all of the books that I read in 2023. There's been a real reckoning, there's been a real summing up, there's been a real looking back. And now I think it's the point to say, what is coming up? What have we got to look forward to? What are the books to get excited about? And also, we spent a lot of time thinking about backlist books and trying to seek out those books that maybe have been overlooked, or things by authors where we've read their new book and we want to go back and read their earlier works. But we shouldn't forget the sheer pleasure that comes from an exciting brand new book that's there in its covers all waiting for you, and there's a real buzz about it, and you're seeing all the reviews and you're getting that buzz. And so where do we come when we want this feeling? We come to Book Bar and we talk to Chrissie Ryan, who has got her finger on the pulse like no one else I know. So we're going to have a look forward to what's coming up. What are the books that she's excited about? What are the books that she's hearing good things about? So Chrissie.
Hello. It's so nice to be back on the pod. And also I've been listening to loads of back episodes over Christmas, and I can't tell you what joy they brought me. It was so nice because, like you said, I'm always thinking months and months ahead. And so it was so nice to listen to what you guys have been reading and to do the opposite of what we're about to do. And it was really refreshing for me. So thanks for bringing me loads of joy.
Well, that makes me really happy to hear that. That's exactly what we hope to do. But yes, let's have a think about things that are coming up. You've got a little list there. Talk us through it. What are the first books that came to mind?
So I've been reading ahead over the last few months. I'm thinking about Book Bar and our customers, but then I'm also thinking more generally. And then I'm also thinking, what do I want to read and what's for me? And there is so many books from authors that I love already coming out this year. I won't go into great depth about these because they're quite far ahead in the year and I haven't read them yet. But there's a new book from Elif Shafak. There's a new book from Sanjeev Sahota called Spoiled Heart. So there's some really big books by established names, which feels really exciting because it's just nice to know that you've got something by someone you love to look forward to. But there is also on this list a new novel from David Nicholls called You Are Here. And I think I have to start with that because firstly, he is a brilliant local author. But secondly, I think he crosses so many different readerships. He appeals to so many different people and everything he writes is so generous and wonderful. And I think it's such good timing for a bit of a David Nicholls novel, given the fact that there's so much going on in the world. And I think we were talking before we started recording about reading things to take us out of that or to remind us about the things that we enjoy in the world. And this is just that. So it's called You Are Here. It's about two people, one of whom is in their late 30s and the other's in their early 40s. And they've both had previous relationships. One of them's just separated from his wife over the last year or so. And their mutual friend says to them, look, you've got to get out more and you're just sitting around your flat fairly miserable and you should come out and do something. Why don't we go on a big long walk? The main character is a big walker and he plans this walk through the Lake District from one coast to the other, basically. So from west to east, ending in North Yorkshire. And it's about this group of friends or people who are all mutual friends with this one person. They go on this walk and lots of them are not big walkers. You know, they're sort of city people who don't do it. And you'd follow them for 5 days and their friendships and maybe even something more. So it's a typical David Nicholls love story, but it also is so enriching in terms of thinking about community and people, and it also makes you just want to put on your walking boots and get out and go hiking, which is not a bad thing to be inspired to do. So yeah.
That sounds great. Obviously, One Day, I think, is the one that most people have read, isn't it? It's one of those books. It's up there with, I don't know, something like The Beach or The Secret History, or there are just certain books, aren't there, that at some point in your life everyone is gonna read.
100%. One Day is probably his most famous, but he also wrote Starter for 10, which was adapted, I think he adapted it actually, into a brilliant film with a young Benedict Cumberbatch and James McAvoy. I love that film, and the book's brilliant. And One Day is just about to have a TV adaptation as well. So it feels like the year of David Nichols, and I think we're in need of it. So,
well, I like the sound of that. And it's good to have a nudge to go back to authors that their names are so familiar. It's almost like they're part of the furniture.
yeah.
And you might not necessarily think to seek out their books, but there's a reason that we love to read books by these authors.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't overlook them just through familiarity.
I can verify Your Here is really good and just what you want it to be. So that's
Great.
good. I really want to talk about a book called All That Glitters by Orlando Whitfield. It was not on my radar at all. And then a few months ago, I went to a showcase, which was Granta and Serpent's Tail, two independent publishers. These showcases, it's for booksellers and journalists and people to go and hear what's coming up, and publishers put them on normally in autumn and spring. The first author was a guy called Orlando Whitfield, never heard of him. And he got on stage and he read from this book. And I thought, oh, great dialogue, what a brilliant novel. And then he was interviewed. And as the interview started, I thought, hold on. And the interview went on and I thought, hold on. Oh, this is non-fiction. The writing was so snappy and the story so unbelievable that it felt like fiction. So it's this art world romp. Bad Blood set in the art world is sort of my one-liner for it, I think.
Sounds great.
Yes. All a true story. It's about a guy called Inigo Philbrick. I mean, what a name. He was a rising star in the art world. He had some connections, as I think lots of people do in that world. He was taken on by a gallery called the White Cube, which is quite a famous gallery in London. And he rose to become quite senior there and ended up setting up with a branch of the White Cube and making lots and lots and lots of money and being very influential in lots of people's careers. What happened was he's now in prison for fraud, because what he was doing was selling pieces of art. Say to you, Kate, you can have 50% of this piece of art, and to you, you can have 50%, and you can have another 50%. And so, because the art world is so unregulated and it's really about what someone will pay for something, he was exploiting that. And he's now in prison for, I think it's something ridiculous like $60 million worth of fraud or something like that.
Wow.
And Orlando Whitfield, who is the author of All That Glitters, was his best friend and at one point business partner, but who was never involved in the scam.
Right.
So it's kind of this real life thriller set in the art world. And I'd learnt loads about the art world as well. It's a real look behind the curtain. Yeah, and just a really interesting book.
That sounds so great. I am so in the mood for reading that because I recently read Helen DeWitt's short story collection, Some Trick.
Oh, I've never read that collection.
So brilliant. And I think, again, an example of The Last Samurai is one of those books. I think lots of people have read The Last Samurai, but maybe haven't thought to go and investigate the other things that she's published. I thought, yeah, I must read more of her. So I read Some Trick, which I absolutely loved. But the first story in Some Trick is called Bruto, and it's about the art world. And it is so fantastic. It is such a fantastic skewering of just how nuts the art world is. I loved it. So I'm ready to lap up.
Oh,
anything.
you'll love this. And that's the thing. I think I knew that the art world was weird, but I don't think I realised how weird and how problematic and troubling in some ways. And it really unpicks that. It's really fascinating. And I suspect the author's probably burned some bridges by writing this
It
book.
sounds like it.
Yeah. But I'd
Or
love to
maybe-
speak with him. He was absolutely brilliant to listen to.
and exonerated himself. Perhaps is more his agenda.
Yeah.
So interesting.
So that's one to look out for. I think that's coming in May. It's got a good cover as well.
Feeling slightly disappointed that that's not coming out till May.
I know, I'm sorry. This is the problem with doing this episode always, is it's like, oh, it's 6 months away.
That's true. That's true. I did say 2024.
Yes, exactly. A book that's getting a lot of buzz that was just included in the Observer's Best Debut Novelists of 2024 is called Ministry of Time by Callie-Anne Bradley, which is this romping time travel novel that is about a man who is brought back from Arctic explorer times. So he's like a Victorian Arctic explorer. We're in the near future. Time travel's been invented, but it's a very secret thing and is being used by the government. People are brought back from various places and times to the modern world, and they are given what is called a bridge, a sort of civil servant who is asked to look after them, essentially, and be their sort of translator in terms of, cultural translator, I suppose, between the modern day and their own time. It's really about the relationship between this bridge and this Arctic explorer from the Victorian period. It sounds like it's all concept. It's a really big concept novel, and it's already been compared to The Time Traveller's Wife and stuff. But it also really interrogates our modern world through the lens of this man. And some of the things he is saying, being a Victorian man, are pretty dodgy. And so it's about him acclimatizing. And then you also are seeing our world through that perspective. And it sort of becomes a bit of a thriller, but it's got a lot of substance to it, if that makes sense. It's already being tipped as one of the really big ones this year. And the author was included in The Observer's Best Debut Novelists of 2024, which just came out. And it's always a pretty good landmark. That list has tipped Douglas Stewart and Sheena Patel, and Jacqueline Crooks, I think, was on it, the author of Fire Rush last year. I think Bonnie Garmus might have been on it. It's always a good list to get your eye on, and I really recommend just going on The Observer after you finish listening to this and having a little scroll through. I think they try and cover the breadth of the industry as best they can.
That's very annoying. One of my resolutions this year is to make more time to read the Sunday papers, and I tried to get hold of The Observer yesterday in 3 different shops, and they were all sold out. Maybe this is why. People know about that.
Yeah. I will put my hands up and say I don't normally get The Observer on a Sunday physically. I intentionally bought it for that feature. So I wonder if there are others like me in the world.
Well, that mystery is explained, but I will put the link in the show notes. Before we get to our next books, would you be interested in getting a weekly email from me full of book recommendations? Are you curious about our library catalogue with our archive of books discussed on the show, where you can add your own suggestions? Would you like to connect with other listeners and share thoughts on books via our chat group? And would you like to join our book club, held over Zoom on the last Sunday of every month? Well, now there's a way you can do all those things, and that's via our Patreon. Check the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/The Book Club Review for the different membership tiers and benefits. I would love to have you join us there. And to all our patrons currently supporting the Book Club Review, thank you. It means a lot, and I'm really grateful. Right, back to the books, and Chrissy has one that's especially close to home.
I'd love to talk about the second novel by a brilliant writer called Francesca Rees. If I may, it could be nepotistic because she is a Book Bar team member. But this book is so extraordinary, I have to speak about it.
I was thinking the name sounded familiar.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. She has featured on this very podcast.
Yeah. Her first novel, Voyeur, came out in 2021, just as we were opening as a shop. It's this sultry novel set in the south of France about a woman who becomes an assistant to a writer. You get flashes of this writer's past as well as what's happening in the present day. I really enjoyed it. And then Frankie, over the last year and a bit ago, became a member of the team, and she has a new novel coming out. And I was both very excited and very nervous because you want to like it. And I am absolutely thrilled to say it's brilliant. It's so good. It's very different to Voyeur. It is set in North Wales, which is where Frankie's from. It is about a young man in his 30s, and he has grown up in this very small community in rural Wales his whole life, and he is a forester. And one of his jobs, there's this big second home that was built by a fairly famous architect. The family don't ever stay there, but he and his mum have traditionally always looked after it, and they're never there. So he sort of sees it as his own. He's got a key and he'll go in and use the house unbeknownst to anyone else, and it's on this beautiful lake in the middle of a forest. And then the house is put up for sale by the owners. It's bought by his childhood sweetheart, who has moved away from the village, married a very wealthy man, and become a very successful film writer in her own right. she's come back and bought this second home. So you get their story and their love story as teenagers, but there's also really interesting political conversation around second home ownership and the impact of that on communities like this small community in Wales. And it also flashes back to the 80s when, in this same part of rural Wales, there was a spate of second homes being burnt down by a group as an act of protest. So you get that storyline. So you get their teenage years in the noughties, the present day now, and then you get the 80s. There's 3 different timelines that all interconnect. And I thought the characters were extremely believable and you really were swept up by their story. But it was also a really interesting bit of Welsh history that I didn't know that much about. It was a really original book. So I'm excited to sell it to you all, as we will definitely be doing. It's called Glass Houses by Francesca Rees. The next book I'm excited about is a book called England is Mine by Nicholas Adamsi, who is a debut novelist, also included on the Observer list. And it's about a young man who is radicalised by playing video games. So he writes a lot about things like Call of Duty and online communities. And it sounds like a really brilliant novel about male mental health, but also about the dark web, but also where the dark web finds itself on the normal web. I haven't read it yet, but it's one that keeps coming up and was also at the Serpent's Tail Granta showcase. And I thought, yeah, that sounds really good.
It sounds potentially book clubby, that one.
Yes. It sounds like he is a big gamer himself. I think it's really interesting the way that games are finding their way into novels. You know, I mean, we've talked a lot on the podcast about Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which you know is a favourite of mine. This obviously is a totally different use of gaming in novels, which I think sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other book that involves gaming is The Beasting. Have you read The Beasting?
I have.
Isn't it? It's got the son, is it PJ?
Yeah.
His story involves that friend he's made through his gaming.
Yeah. I mean, as a parent reading that whole story arc is just terrifying, but so good.
Yeah, totally. I'm not a parent, but yeah, you can see, how do you know what's going on? I think that's what this book, England is Mine, is partly about. It sounds really interesting.
Paul Murray wrote the most fascinating article for, I think it was the New York Times, on virtual reality environments. So that's where you wear a headset. And this is Mark Zuckerberg's new project. This is his vision for Meta. And so Paul Murray basically tested it out and had all these really strange encounters with very odd individuals who were sort of doing the same as him, really testing it out. But he was obviously there as a journalist, felt he couldn't really admit to that because he felt that would upset this social dynamic that was on there. But it was so fascinating and insightful about how this relates to reality, whether this is something that's going to be woven into the way we live our lives or not. He really thought it through in a way I thought was so interesting. If I can, I'll link to the article. But reading that was the thing that then made me want to read The Beasting. Because I was so fascinated by his point of view in that. And I really was like, oh, wow. And sure enough, then it is woven in this really interesting way into that novel.
That's a really fun way to have got into The Beasting.
Yeah.
An angle that I wouldn't have imagined to been the thing that was picked up on. It's part of the book that's really stayed with me, I think, that storyline. And it's silly that it feels like it's unusual for gaming to be represented in a novel like that. But I'm pleased that it is because it's so part of our cultural identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
I think the thing about Paul Murray's investigation into this AI world is that the point is right now there's nothing there that you would really want to go and do anyway. But I suppose the question is, what happens when there is something that draws people, when there is something that people want to go and do? We don't know what that is yet, but it's interesting that this arena is being developed where that is a real possibility. And what's it going to mean when suddenly we would rather be in some virtual space than in real life? I mean, we all have that to a certain extent with our phones at the minute, but we're still physically here. What's going to happen when we're not present? We're in some other space. It's a really interesting thing to consider, and I was very happy that Paul Murray was the man to do it for me.
I also think that is why that book is really brilliant, because it is interrogating so many things, everything from that to climate change to the financial crash. It does it in a way that is purely through the lens of these individual lives and doesn't seem to be making a higher point.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Ultimately, it is an entertaining read, and that pulls you through.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
which is quite a difficult thing to pull off, I think. And
he really does.
what are we saying here? That we think he should have won the book? That we're still not over it? I mean, poor Paul Lynch, very worthy, worthwhile. Prophet Song was an extraordinary book, I thought. But yeah, it's a shame that we just can't get over the fact that the Bee Sting didn't win. Anyway, we must move on. It's 2024. We must move on. And of course, that will be out in paperback at some point this year, won't it?
Yeah.
So it will find
I
a...
can't remember when, actually, but I don't think it's that far away. Certainly this half, I think.
I've heard that the publishing industry is considering phasing out hardbacks. Have you heard about this?
I have not heard about this.
Maybe this is more of a US thing because they were talking about it on the Book Riot podcast. And I was so interested. I believe the thing is financially they don't make that much sense. They're expensive to produce and people hold off from buying a hardback because they wait for the paperback. And I think in the way that everything is so commercially driven, the economics of it don't really add up.
Oh, interesting.
And they might phase them out. And we would only have paperbacks. But anyway, it doesn't sound like this is a conversation that you're aware of in the UK, which is...
No, I mean, I think there's always conversations around hardbacks and why do we do them and who buys them. I know lots of people buy hardbacks because I have a bookshop. So I feel like we do sell hardbacks. I understand the arguments around, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to wait to spend less on it, which I do understand. In my head, it's a bit like going to the cinema. You go and see something in the cinema and you're happy to pay more to do that because you want to go and see it now and you can't wait. I think typically hardbacks were a big thing for libraries because they are more durable. Hardbacks are actually better for libraries.
That makes sense.
So I guess with the decline of libraries, sadly, maybe that gives publishers less of an incentive to publish a hardback. I don't know. From a bookshop, I do quite like hardbacks because for us, it gives us something really exciting to focus on. It gives us 2 rounds. It gives us an opportunity to say, listen to this, buy this book on the first go, and then listen again, buy this book again. And I don't mean to say buy it twice. I mean, if you missed it the first time round or you are happy to wait, then it's 2 moments in the calendar for you to be able to talk about something that you love. So from my perspective, I really enjoy that side of having hardbacks and paperbacks.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for it, aren't there? And the other thing that publishers have is the opportunity to position books slightly differently when they bring out the paperback. I was very interested to see the paperback cover of Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson, which was a enjoyable social comedy, I suppose, with these very wealthy people in New York. This one family it centres around who have millions and millions in the bank. I read it, I enjoyed it very much. But the cover was quite interesting to me because, first of all, the UK cover doesn't have a pineapple on it. It has orange.
Yeah.
I was like, what? And secondly, it didn't really seem to me to represent particularly what the book was about. And I much preferred the US cover, which was a painting of some objects in a domestic environment that actually seems to me that it really did express the theme of this book, which is very much about this house and the interior of this house and all these family objects that have been passed down through the generations. But what really startled me was when I saw the paperback cover, which is a young woman turning towards the camera, sunglasses, very Gen Z, very sunny, bright yellow cover. I mean, that probably is about right. But it was just really interesting to me how different it was. And that they're obviously shifting it slightly more towards almost Curtis Sittenfeld's romantic comedy cover. This feels very, you have to know all these covers to get these comparisons. So I apologise, not a great conversation for radio, but... there is that little bit of interest, isn't there, when the paperback cover comes out. I'll put links to them, listeners, so if you wish to, you could come down this rabbit hole with us and go and look them yourself.
I love a cover rabbit hole, honestly. I'm always fascinated by when publishers choose to do a different cover. You can work out the logic behind some things. Oh, this needs to go into this retailer, and so that retailer's what they need is the priority here. There's all these conversations. I mean, you used to work in that part of the industry, didn't you, Kate?
Yes, although I never worked on fiction books. I used to design covers for beautiful coffee table art books, which is a very different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I can't imagine being a fiction or even popular non-fiction designer. I think it would be very, very hard.
Well, having worked in sales in publishing industry is fascinating because everyone, including me, I will admit, loves to get their oar in and and give their opinion. And I have no envy for art directors for that reason, because I think it must be really annoying.
Yeah.
Where were we?
What else is on your list?
Oh, there's so much. There's a new novel by Julia Armfield. I'm an enormous Julia Armfield fan, and we've spoken about Our Wives Under the Sea on this podcast a lot.
Fantastic
and I know that it was
fantastic book club book.
Oh, it's so good. And this is her new book called Private Rights, which has been billed as Climate Crisis King Lear.
Okay.
So
I've got that slight clenching in my stomach I feel whenever there's a book that I feel is going to challenge me and make me think about the climate crisis.
Yeah. She's a new publisher called Fourth Estate. She was previously at Picador. And I was at a showcase, similar setup to the one I've previously spoken about. And the way she described it sounded so good. I mean, it sounds a bit more epic. I think it's set in a moment in time where climate change has caused lots of water, i.e. lots of rain, to the extent that things have been reshaped and changed. And it's about a relationship of a father with his daughters. So that's the King Lear element, I think. I'm yet to read it, as you can probably tell, but it does sound very good. And I think the amazing thing about Julia is that she has such a steady hand, doesn't she, as a writer? I think she is extremely intelligent as a thinker. So she really makes you think about things, but you never feel like you are thinking too deeply while you're doing it. You're immersed in the story. So I'm not surprised that she's doing something that sounds quite challenging. Our Wives Under the Sea and her short story collection, Salt Slow, both had elements of horror about them. There's something there in this as well. So I'm really interested, but I also think the subject matter doesn't surprise me from her. And yeah, I'm sure it's going to be brilliant.
Well, perhaps this is the moment to talk about, there's an elephant in my reading room, and that is the book Fireweather, A True Story from a Hotter World by John Vaillant, which won the Baillie Gifford Nonfiction Prize last year. That is such a good prize for flagging up amazing books. And normally the winner of that prize would be an auto read for me. I would not hesitate for a second. But this year, knowing that it was about this catastrophic fire that took place in the north of Canada. So this is an area where oil is extracted from tar buried in the sands, and it has to be physically excavated and then processed. And the whole town exists in order to serve this process of extracting the tar. And it's extremely profitable. They have found a way to make a lot of money. And as a result, this huge engine is driving prosperity in Canada and also making a lot of money for the people who run the companies who are selling the product. But the town was destroyed by a huge wildfire. And the book is about how that fire was made more serious by the effects of the climate changing and the fact that it's so much warmer than it used to be. And I was listening to the New York Times podcast and they had John Vaillant on, and it sounded so mesmerizing, this story. I found myself for the first time thinking, no, I actually really need to read this. But at the same time, I'm still a bit, oh gosh, because it just sounded really terrifying. You've got it on the shelf over there, and I will read it. But next to it on the shelf, you have got the book called Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. And I had been aware of this book. I had read about this book. I actually sent the link to Laura when I first read about it. I said to her, this is the first book I've come across that sounds like something that offers hope and something that I could read and maybe feel better about things instead of worse. And I believe that's the story behind it, isn't it? It's taking everything that we know about climate change, but trying to focus on the positives of what we can do to change the world, where humans have been able to come together to create things or build things or do new things that have made a positive impact, and just making sure that we're factoring that into our thinking as well as all the terrifying doom and gloom. And one of the interesting things that hooked my interest about Fireweather when I heard about it is, yes, it's a story about this apocalyptic fire and the dangers there, but it's also a story about how every single person in that town was evacuated, how no one died, how 90,000 people came together to get out of that town safely. And that was an extraordinary story about community and about people coming together and doing things the right way and helping each other. And they didn't panic. They did what they needed to do and they all got out. So balancing that out, that human story against this story of what was going on with the climate, suddenly made it feel like this is something I really want to read. And I think it's good to flag up Not the End of the World. It's championed by Rutger Bregman, who himself is someone who has written books about the good news that there is in the world and how we don't really hear enough about it. Yeah. He says, shines with practicality and positivity. It will banish your feelings of doom, help you focus on what's really important, and make you want to be a part of the most effective solutions to our greatest challenges. And I think it's that, isn't it? It's that we need things that encourage us not to turn away and not to try and ignore or hide from what's going on, but to face up to it, knowing that we can make a difference, which is not something you hear very often, is it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting balance, isn't it? I said to you earlier that I wondered whether Fireweather was the book that we should read. and Not the End of the World was the book we want to read. But the more I look at Not the End of the World, I think, A, it's glowing with endorsements from Bill Gates through to David Wallace Wells, through to Margaret Atwood. Part of me thinks, oh, is it just optimism? But also, is a book like that so important because we do need optimism? Because if we don't have optimism, then what's going to compel us to move forward? You know?
Exactly. I think that.
But it's getting lots of buzz, and I've heard her speak about it briefly, and she sounded really interesting.
What else is on your list?
There's a book by an actor called Roxy Dunn that is called As Young as This. It is about a woman in her mid-30s, and she is making a big life decision. And in order to chart how she's got to this point in her life, you go back to meeting her at 16. It's her life told through the different relationships she's had. It really swept me up. It's all told in the second person, which I think is quite brave.
So that's we do this, is that right? I always get my muddled up with my persons.
So it's, you go to the door and answer the doorbell. Quite hard to pull off. People that do it successfully, to me, in recent years, Caleb Azuma-Nelson, I think, does it successfully in Open Water. Jonathan Escoffrey in...
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Such a fan of If I Survive You, which is one of my favourite discoveries from the Booker shortlist.
Yeah. I loved it. So good. I actually listening to an audiobook and really enjoying it. I never know as a bookseller with a physical bookshop whether I should say that, but I think it's a new way that we're reading and quite important. I certainly enjoy listening to audiobooks as well as reading the physical thing. But yeah, the voice is so strong, and the paperback's out quite soon, so I wanted to read it.
I've been listening to The Fraud, read by Zadie Smith.
Is it read by Zadie Smith?
And she's so good because she has to do so many accents.
Yeah.
And actually, you're like, oh, wow, you're really good at this. I heard an interview where she was talking about how she worked with, because her main character is Scottish.
Yes.
And so she had worked with a dialect coach to nail that Scottish accent. But there are others in there, and it's just great. It's really great. I've really been enjoying it.
Wow. Oh, that's so interesting that she's reading it herself. I love that. And particularly because that's, like you say, not a mean feat. There are lots of different voices, lots of different characters from all over the world. Yeah, you'd have to be quite confident.
I mean, almost a part of me had the slight feeling of, oh, and you're good at this as well?
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Are you enjoying The Fraud?
Yes, I am very much, very much. I wonder almost if I'm enjoying it slightly more because of that experience of having her read it to me, because there's something about the way she delivers the lines where you do get this sense of her own understanding of the meaning behind them.
Yes.
Which is an extra kind of frisson that you don't get when you're just reading it on the page.
Yeah,
that I love. I love that. We don't really have a word for what that feeling is.
Yeah.
But it's there. It's almost this tangible sense of her mind at work that is really good.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, love it. And so you only got so much time to read. I know your team are reading with you, so you're getting feedback from them. I imagine you're looking ahead and there are some books that you are able to just think, right, that sounds interesting, flagging them up to yourself. Have you got any on your list that sort of fit into that category?
So many still on my to-read pile. The first of which is a book called The Chain by Shemin Suleiman, which is non-fiction. I think she's a journalist in America. I had been following on Twitter for a while before hearing about this book. It's about her true story of going to an abortion clinic with her boyfriend and coming out of the appointment and he's gone and she never sees him again. I think it then transpires, if I'm correct, that that's not the first time that's happened.
Oh, my goodness.
I think it then uses that as a point to look at this man, but also those experiences happening to women generally.
Is this fiction or non-fiction?
Non-fiction.
Right, wow. Yeah, that didn't go the way I thought that story was going to go.
No, exactly. It sounds absolutely phenomenal. I'm yet to read it, but I'd heard that premise and thought, wow, yes, I want to read that.
Yeah.
In this spellbinding memoir, she exposes one man's control over many women and the trauma he left behind, and celebrates the sisterhood that formed in his wake.
Wow.
I also want to talk about a book called Help Wanted by Adele Waldman, who wrote a book called The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. A former colleague of mine absolutely loved this book, and it was really hard to source from America. And then I was given a copy of this called Help Wanted, her second novel, I think. And Help Wanted is about a group of supermarket workers in America who overthrow the order of things. What a great premise.
Really good. Love
really
that.
Cool. Really cool. I've got a copy at home and it's been gradually working its way up the pile. It's coming in March, I believe. And I think it's already been lauded by Elif Batuman, the author of The Idiot.
Yeah. I was just reading her book, Either Or, this morning.
Oh, well, there we go.
Well, I mean, I've read it before, but I have it lying around my kitchen, and occasionally, if I'm idly waiting for something, I dip in. And every time I do, I think, this book is completely extraordinary. Her writing is so good. Even if you just read a paragraph, that paragraph will give you something. And I love books that do that. And also, she's so funny.
Yeah, I think what's great about a writer like Elif Batuman is the fact that there's wit and humour, but also quite a lot of depth. And I've read the first chapter of Help Wanted just to get a flavour of it when I was choosing what to take home for Christmas. And I thought, yes, this has got that wryness to it, as well as social commentary. And yeah, I'm really excited to read it. So that's one I'm looking forward to.
That is my tip for anyone feeling overwhelmed or like TBR pile is just too long, is take the time. I had a rule. When I get a new book, the first thing I do before I do anything else is I read the first chapter, which usually takes about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
The thing about that is you're probably still going to put it aside. It's not like you're necessarily going to want to read it right then. Although sometimes you do. Sometimes there's a first chapter that basically makes you want to read the rest. It's more that you then have a sense of what that book is like, what that author's voice is like, what's waiting for you. And I find that really helpful when I'm in that moment where I'm between books and I'm thinking, oh, what do I want to read next? Because I remember. And also, I think it stops you feeling so overwhelmed by all those books waiting for you because you've sampled them, you've thought about them, you have processed them a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's a really good habit that I myself have slightly fallen out of, and I must get back into it because it was so good.
Yeah, and it really helps me to know what I'm in the mood for. It's not about saying, no, I don't want to read this or I do want to read it. You're just reading it to almost file, this is the tone and this is the thing. This is the style of it. So when I'm in the mood for that, that's what I'm going to go to.
Yeah.
You might not be in the mood for it at the moment. It's not a rejection. It's a noting of where it's going to take you.
Yeah.
And I think you can do that quite easily in a few pages.
Yeah. I could sit here all day, I really could, and talk to you about upcoming reads. I'm having such a nice time. But I think we must be mindful of the amount of time that people have got to listen. So let me pin you down to one more and then we'll wrap it up.
The one I want to finish on is a book called Come and Get It by Kylie Reid, which is coming out at the end of this month. I wanted to leave you with something that you can almost go and buy now. Lots of you will remember Kylie Reid's debut novel, Such a Fun Age, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize and was an enormous hit in 2019-2020. Come and Get It is her second novel. It's a campus novel. It follows two characters and it's about this young student who is paid to live in campus dormitories. I guess like a warden, that's definitely not what they're called, but a live-in student from an older year who's there to look after the first year students, essentially, which exists both in the UK as a role, but particularly in the US, it's a big thing. And she develops a relationship with an academic who is come to campus as a temporary academic, but is also there to do some research, ostensibly for a book about money and students and class. And they form this bond. You follow their two different strands. It's a really good campus novel. She makes you cringe in the way that Such a Fun Age. Did you ever read Such a Fun Age?
Yeah.
It makes you cringe in the same way. You just think, exactly that feeling of, oh my gosh, people are awful, aren't they? And she's really good at making you do that. And I think she's got a real skill for getting into the cracks, if that makes sense, of people's emotions. And yeah, I really enjoyed Come and Get It, which is out, I think, on the 30th of January. One to look out for soon.
Well, Chrissy, I've got everything I hoped. I'm going to leave here buzzing with excitement about all of these fantastic books, as I always do after any conversation with you. But I think great to have it at the beginning of the year and our listeners get to experience it too and get excited about all these books together. It's going to be great. 2024 is going to be great.
I think so. Thanks for having me. There is so many books to talk about and this was just a flavour. But yeah, enjoy your reading in 2024. That's the main thing.
That's nearly it for this episode. You'll find all the books mentioned, plus publication dates, in the show notes, either in your podcast app, or head over to our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you'll also find a transcript. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support us, please do leave a review via your podcast app, which helps other listeners find us. And if you want to get closer to the show, don't forget there's our Patreon, where for less than the price of a coffee a month, you'll get a weekly bookish email from me and access to our chat group and book spreadsheets, plus the knowledge that you're supporting the pod. Find out more about Chrissy and Book Bar at bookbaruk.com. In our next episode, I'll be catching up with Laura and we'll be swapping notes about our recent reads. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.